Well, it's been a lion one day, lamb the next type of march. Wild temperature swings, the maple trees bloom, but the fishing is off to a bit of a slow start.
And now for a look at a decidedly different kind of life. The scrawny life.
There were good numbers of midges and stoneflies hatching in the river that day, as you can see. The base of the food web, at least, is intact. Those insects will feed suckers, and suckers in turn are food for pike and smallmouth and walleye. There were some smaller pike in the river. Then I worked the upper part of the Iowa Falls impoundment, hoping to find some larger pike, but I did not raise a larger pike there, so they perhaps are spawning somewhere else in the impoundment. After that, the weather turned freezing cold again, and followed by a bunch of rain. All the rivers are bank full and muddy now. Some friends and I did manage to finally get up to a restaurant called Whatcha Smokin' in the small town of Luther. And for brisket sandwiches, this is a Texas style barbecue restaurant. Always crowded up there. People come from all over. And you can see why. That brisket almost just melted in your mouth. It was really good, very flavorful. You can see great big smoke ring on there and everything. That was worth the trip. Well worth the trip. Next time, I think we'll be a little more strategic and bring a cooler. This day was cold and windy. So windy, in fact, I had to put a filter on the audio. That's why it sounds like we're in a tunnel. We're snagging for big head carp here. It looks like we've got one of significant size. Oh yeah, yeah, he's gone. This is gonna take quite a while. This is going to be a lengthy fight. Let's go ahead and just skip to the end. These, of course, are invasive species. They're planktivores. Interestingly, they don't have a stomach. They cannot swallow anything. They only drink. And what they do is filter the zooplankton that they gulp out of the water, and some phytoplankton as well, I'm sure. But by removing a lot of the zooplankton, they contribute to algae blooms, and as well as hurting the recruitment of native fish species like walleyes and white bass and so forth. So I'm doing what I can, just playing a small part to remove these fish. Fishermen, of course, will never be able to remove them all, but if every licensed angler took one day a year to do this, that we'd make an impact. They are edible. They can be eaten. Here I made some lettuce wraps with a dipping sauce, and there I made some noodle broth with the bones and so forth. Now this is something that I'll probably rant about off and on in several different episodes. It's been on my mind for a long time, but I still really don't have a firm opinion on whether it's good or bad. And what I'm talking about is restoring the oak savanna. At some point, of course, the Native Americans were managing this landscape using fire and by maintaining huge herds of large grazing animals, and they were maintaining the landscape to produce a certain result. And somewhere along the line, someone described what was here at the time of European colonization an oak savanna. And this, of course, was maintained by fire and herds of grazing animals and trees that Native Americans were removing and trees that they were planting. And just because they weren't practicing the intensive monoculture form of agriculture that Europeans practiced does not mean that they were not practicing agriculture. They were managing the landscape they lived in. And I don't know if that was specifically the intent in this particular case, but there are other places around here where they've posted signs and said that their intent was to restore the oak savanna. They leave the large oak trees and cut down everything else. And there may be certain benefits to doing this. I'm always happy to see invasive species like Lonicera macchii being removed. And opening up the canopy reduces the humidity and helps those large oak trees that remain be less susceptible to fungal diseases like oak wilt and bur oak blight and so forth. And here is a forest that was cleared in the same way a couple of years ago. But as you can see, what comes back is not an oak savanna because there was no fire and there's no large herd of grazing animals. What comes back is an impenetrable tangle of Lonicera macchii and multiflora rose, invasive species both. And here you can see some of the honey locust trees that have been girdled, some successfully, some unsuccessfully. The same sort of treatment that the previous strip of forest we were looking at had received. And interestingly, if you look in the background, those hillsides that were not cleared, although they do have the same invasive species, there's fewer of them. There are fewer invasive species where the forest was left as it was. So, although I don't have a firm opinion on whether this is good or bad or whatever, I'm just asking the question, what are we really accomplishing with this? Are we really restoring the oak savanna? Or are we creating a circumstance where invasive species go wild and completely take over? And maybe that's what's good. Of course, Lonicera macchii, and by Lonicera macchii I'm referring to the Amur honeysuckle in common parlance. It feeds songbirds, and its proliferation has resulted in a boom in the songbird population, and multiflora rose. Perhaps it results in a boom in the rabbit population or something. There are creatures that benefit from this state of affairs. Here we have some Neogyromitra brunea. This is a species I've touched on in some other episodes. Note that well-decayed log with plenty of ground contact and the fruiting bodies emerging from the ground but surrounding that log or that food source. I think we can say from experience now that they are not species specific. And although they seem to prefer rich soils, it's not an absolute necessity. Here is a large spring ephemeral pool. You can't see it on camera, but it was absolutely just churning with mosquito larvae. We've had enough rain, and then we needed rain, but we've had enough to fill up these pools, and it's going to be a terrible year for mosquitoes, I'm afraid. And here's another strip of forest that was cleared 2 years ago, and you can see you can't even move around in it. It's just an intense tangle of multiflora rose and Lonicera macchii. There's the few large oak trees that they left standing, and there's Lonicera macchii, and you can see in the distance the hillsides that were left alone that still have a natural growth of forests. Although they have some invasive species, it's not nearly the intense tangle that came up in the supposed oak savanna. You can see that hillside in the distance is much more open than the hillside that was cleared. There's a moor honeysuckle, Lonisramachii. So we're really just asking the question here: what what are we really accomplishing here? And these little ferns that were once shaded by the forest uh, will now be much drier and hotter, and their days are numbered basically. Here we see some black cherry and hackberry and some hop hornbeam. Those are trees that can be utilized by songbirds as well, and importantly, perhaps at different times of the year. There's some more black cherry, hackberry again, and you can see it's plain to see what's going to happen here. The floor of the forest, or what once was a forest, is covered with these little sprouts of Lonisramachii and or multiflora rose, and with the canopy opened up, they're simply going to just spring up and take over. It's going to happen here just like it has in all the other places they've done this. And you can see some of the trees are girdled. That's a smaller oak that was girdled. There's a honey locust that was girdled. I'm not sure why, what the point of that is either, other than that they're just larger trees that maybe are difficult to deal with. There's a couple more honey locusts that have been girdled. And what does that create an opening for disease that later backfires? That's contrary to the intended purpose. Here we can see the problem. There's a little shoot of Lonisramachii that's just absolutely going to spring up, and there's multiflora rose. Now that the canopy's opened up, they're just going to take off and take over, and it will be just as much of a tangled, impenetrable mess of invasive species as those other hillsides we've looked at. There's some honey locust. There's a few more that have been girdled. So again, what are we really accomplishing here? We're certainly not restoring an oak savanna in any way. So it just I don't know. It's something that I don't have. There's a mulberry that's been girdled. That's a potential food tree for wild animals as well. Here's a nice black cherry, and perhaps I'd like to come back and look around that black cherry stump next week for morel mushrooms. But they've treated the stump with chemicals to kill it. Do the mushrooms pick up some of those chemicals? Some species are known to accumulate, toxic metals and so forth. So, unintended consequences. Here's a look at that honey locust. It really is a beautiful. It's not used for lumber because it's covered with thorns and stuff, but it really is a beautiful and interesting wood. There's the painted hickory borer. This is apparently the breeding season for them, and whatever role they were playing in the forest, that's now been turned topsy turvy, and we cannot maintain the landscape with fire as Native Americans once did, not safely anyway. We've gone past that point, and we cannot graze large herds of animals on these lands. We've passed that point as well. And the state and county don't have the manpower to continually keep cutting back these areas. I really just wonder if perhaps it's better to leave the diverse forest that was there, just leave it alone and let it be what it is.